changes in the development and distribution of vaccines and drug therapies as a result of COVID-19. That's the topic of my conversation today with Robert Eubanks. He's Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences with West Monroe. Robert, hi, welcome.
Hello, Bob. How you doing? It's great to be here.
Good. So how are we going to manage to produce and distribute an estimated 1 billion doses of vaccines in 2021?
Yeah, Bob, that's a wonderful question. There's a lot of challenges associated with that, right? So the way that these next generation of vaccines that are coming to market, so there's a couple different dimensions here. Let's talk a little bit through this. So vaccines traditionally were developed over about a 10-year life cycle. And with this next generation of technology, it's coming to market, or that we're bringing to market right now, which is primarily the messenger RNA approach, we're able to reduce that 10-year time frame down to about a 1-year time frame, right? That looks like we'll probably start seeing some things come out of phase 3 clinical trials here within the next couple months. Now, there are going to be some challenges associated with bringing all these dosages to market, right? So it's a brand new way that we're going to be manufacturing these drugs. It's not the normal way that we used to manufacture vaccines and where we get the culture from the virus, and then we'd modulate it a little bit and find out what produced the correct immune response within the humans. Instead, what we're doing is we're actually coming up with the messenger RNA, and that's a technique that tells the DNA what to do and how to create a cell. So in effect, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be giving ourselves the instruction booklet on how to create antibodies for the coronavirus. But given the way that there's a uniqueness, and this is the first time we're bringing these sorts of therapies to market, there's going to be some challenges associated with how to scale up manufacturing. So the CDMOs, the contract developers and manufacturing organizations are going to kind of have to step up their game a little bit. And then there's another unique factor associated with the transportation and storage of this next generation of therapy. So I'm not sure what the listeners know about this, but this next generation of therapies that are coming to market right now anyway, and I've seen a few ranges on some of the temperature conditions they have to transport and store these at. We're talking about between negative 80 and maybe around 100 degrees Fahrenheit that they have to be stored and transported at. That's going to create some logistical challenges you can imagine, right? So right now, we don't quite have the infrastructure built out to support this. And you can think that, we're going to have to get through those sorts of challenges as well. There'll be some challenges associated with getting the logistics out to some of the more rural areas of the country as well. So there's good news in the fact that these next therapeutic assets are coming to market, but there will be some supply chain related challenges to getting them out, to not only across the US, but there's also the broader global concerns as well.
So there is a cold chain. There is a cold chain system out there already, obviously for pharmaceuticals and food and the like already existing, but not at scale, in some way not totally suitable for this purpose?
Yes, sir. Yeah, sir. That's very correct. So the cold chain's been around for a while, primarily with the biologics, right? So those are therapies made from like living human organisms, like basic proteins. And so there is a cold chain, supply chain associated with that, but not to the degree, no pun intended, that we have to support the messenger RNA therapies that are coming to market. And there's not quite the scale either, because we need to think about providing the inoculations across the US. And maybe for some of the therapeutics, we don't need to quite have the extent and scale that we have with the COVID vaccines.
Do you think that will production take place domestically?
So this is a wonderful question. And there's a couple different dimensions of this. So yes, we will see some domestic production take place. However, what's happened over the past couple decades is that the drug industry has shifted some of its production to some of the lower cost areas of the world. And so that has created some environments where we're going to be producing these assets in places like maybe could be China, it could be India, it could be placed in Southeast Asia, as well as some production facilities in Europe and some limited maybe production facilities here in North America.
Okay, well, there we have that long supply line. We already found out what that does to us when China production factories shut down. Are we therefore opening ourselves up once again to the risk of disruption at a time when we need these supplies more than ever? Why not try to localize as much as possible? I understand this is the way it's been, but why not at the same time try to bring that home?
Yeah, so that's something that we're probably going to start seeing more of. And there's a couple different dimensions of this, and let's talk through this a little bit in a bit more depth. So as we just kind of indicated, for about the past 20 years or so, a lot of the production was moved to lower cost centers of production around the world. There's a landed cost issue, right? There are some economics associated with producing APIs and such in lower cost areas. But as what the COVID virus showed us, we're going to need to rethink a lot of that. So maybe landed cost isn't one of the only things or a major contributor. We have to start factoring in risk, right? So if we have production of these assets taking place in an area where a pandemic could crop up again, and where people can't go to the manufacturing facilities for whatever reason to actually produce a drug, obviously that could introduce a shortage into the global supply chain. That's one key factor that we have to take into consideration. The other factor we need to take into consideration is geopolitical risk. And so we need to maybe start considering where we want to start producing some of these assets in case certain geopolitical things happen throughout the world, because for whatever reason, we may not want to be dependent on another part of the world for producing some of our life-saving therapies that we may need from time to time.
Yeah.
So we'll start to see a redistribution of manufacturing. And it wouldn't surprise me if we start building over time new facilities here, probably in the North American area.
Should we be thinking then in terms of a so-called multi-pronged approach? And if so, what does that really mean? Is that the multi-pronged supply, multi-pronged producers, distributors? I mean, what exactly are we talking about there?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to answer that is probably answer all the above. We're probably going to need to kind of hedge our risk a little bit, and as opposed to putting maybe concentrating some of our things to be for the most efficient reasons, we're going to want spreading that risk out a little bit more. So we could very well see CDMOs maybe kind of relocates production out of Southeast Asia, maybe to European sites, maybe someplace in Central America. We could be good. We used to do a lot of actual drug production in Puerto Rico. Yeah. So that was, many people may or may not know that, but for the longest period of time, there was a tremendous amount of production taking place in Puerto Rico. And via some tax law changes, some of that production moved out. This could be a very good time to reconsider bringing some of that back. There's a workforce there that understands operating in a regulated environment. And it would probably be good maybe to relocate some of that. And same thing with the supply chain, the way that we're going to look at rebalancing it as well. So we are going to need to take a look at balancing things out through multiple sources.
Yeah. Are there not trade-offs, though, we have to be very careful to take into account? For instance, in this need for speed, as we're rushing this to market, what might be the impact on productivity, on operating costs, on service levels, on employee and customer satisfaction? Are there some degradations there we have to look out for?
There could be, okay, so for some of the productivity, obviously, if we decide that we need to stand up multiple sites, right, to kind of hedge your risk a little bit, there could be some additional cost factors, but we're going to offset that, I think, via the use of technology. So for example, if we decide we're going to stand up some new manufacturing capacity here in North America, some people may think that that's going to be great because we're going to get a lot of very good, well-paying manufacturing jobs and maybe a few locations around North America. The challenge with that's going to be is that when they stand these new manufacturing sites, they're going to be highly automated. And so we'll go to as close to lights out manufacturing as we can. So there will be higher paying jobs associated with it. They're probably more like software engineering type jobs than they are what we might consider traditional manufacturing and supply chain jobs. But the automation will help offset some of the cost that we may see by having multiple facilities out there over the longer term. It also helps hedge us against the risk of pandemics and what happens to the human workforce during these things. So for example, if we stand up a critical site that does messenger RNA, because messenger RNA will start, once we get past this COVID bubble, the scientists are going to start turning messenger RNA and some other things that are coming to market on what can we do for other viruses out there that we've never been able to solve for as well, like Ebola, AIDS, right? AIDS has been around for decades now. We can treat it like a chronic disease, but there's nothing to prevent it or cure it. So we can take a look at messenger RNA for those, and God forbid any other virus that Mother Nature may decide to spring on us at some point as well. Yeah. So we will want these facilities to be able to run as autonomous as possible and not rely so much on the human workforce.
How interesting that this might be completely, if not totally alter, but have a big influence on just what constitutes a vaccine going forward for any number of viruses you might want to address in the future. I'm wondering, though, what are the major bottlenecks that we need to worry about the most? Where are they most encountered throughout the drug and biologic supply chain?
Yeah, so there's okay, that's a wonderful question. There's a couple of main components to this, so we'll unpack both of these. Some of the bottlenecks, we kind of talked about this a little bit early in our conversation. Due to the fact, so for the drug industry, we'll talk about the legacy manufacturing, we'll talk about the messenger RNA and some of the bottlenecks associated with both those. From the legacy drug industry, we have what's known as the API, that's active pharmaceutical ingredient. So if it's different than if you're in the technology world, it's not application programming interface, it's
Thanks for clarifying
API.
that.
Yeah,
Right.
the API. Well, I kind of go back and forth, and I got to remember like which audience that I'm talking to if I use that acronym API. But the API is the actual molecule that does whatever the therapy is going to do. That's where the intellectual property from the drug company is. It's the actual molecule that does that. And so when we say small molecule and large molecule, that's like a literal thing, like a small molecule, like aspirin, for example. 21 atoms of the molecule we can ingest, and it diffuses across our intestinal tract and goes out and does what it does. A lot of the APIs for the small molecules are the ones that we moved offshore to different parts of the world, let's say in China or in India. And so we saw some disruption associated with COVID. So there's a period in time where we had a little bit of a challenge getting some of the APIs out of China. And at one point, India, I believe, actually said some of the APIs they weren't going to ship overseas. They were keeping them in country to first kind of support any needs that they may have in country. So there's
makes sense from their standpoint. Yeah,
it does. It does. And that exposed some of that risk. And all of a sudden, we've all said, holy cow, we need to kind of start rethinking this landed cost versus the broader risk profile that we brought upon ourselves. So those are some of the bottlenecks that took place from the legacy manufacturing with regards to this next generation of therapies, whether it's messenger RNA or cell and gene therapies, the next generation of the immuno-oncology assets known as CAR T. There's going to be some of the storage and transportation problems that we talked about. Well, first, we have to scale manufacturing. And then once we scale manufacturing, gee whiz, how do we get these things out around the world with some of the temperature control constraints that we're going to have on them? So those are a couple of the primary bottlenecks that we've seen here over the past 6 months with the legacy assets, and then thinking for the next 6 months to a year with the next generation of assets.
And of course, do all this so that the vaccine itself is not prohibitively expensive. In many cases, we want it to be free to certain people, and we want it to be cheap to others. And so this sounds like a tremendous challenge that the industry is facing in getting this stuff to market, right? But I guess it's going to happen one way or another.
Yeah, it sure is. And this is where we're going to need sort of like the public-private partnership. Like the government's going to have to help us out in some way. We can't really expect the drug industry to necessarily fund this on their own. And it is truly a global health challenge, right? So we can't say, well, it costs too much. We have to figure it out. We just can't say it costs too much to do this, because we need to eradicate this virus. And we need to also then, as we're building it out, we need to build it out with the future in mind for like the next generation of cell and gene therapies and potential new messenger RNA assets that come out. We can kind of amortize the cost of this infrastructure we're going to build out with the future in mind.
Yeah. Well, this is a fascinating subject, Robert Eubanks, and I guess we'll find out how it all plays out in the next year or so. But thank you very much for giving us a preview as to what are the big challenges that are necessary to bring this vaccine and future vaccines to market in such a critical time. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.